Today's lesson is 4.2 in our Unit 2, Ecosystems and Population Change. We're looking at developing a theory to explain change. So we'll start by just going over what our hypothesis is. So science attempts to explain the natural world through observation and testing. So the development of scientific laws and theories begins with a hypothesis. A hypothesis is basically a possible explanation to a question based on fact and observation. And when a hypothesis is tested over and over with consistent results, scientists are able to develop a scientific theory that allows them to make successful predictions and explanations about the world. A scientific law is also developed from repeated testing of a hypothesis. And a law is better at predicting an outcome, but doesn't attempt to explain the mechanism that led to the outcome. So laws and theories are very important in the development of scientific knowledge, even if they are wrong. So some evolutionary scientists like Charles Darwin, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, they use their observations to explain the phenomenon of evolution. So today we're looking at how do theories explaining evolutionary change compare, and what theories attempt to explain the pace of evolutionary change. So again, hypotheses, theories, and laws. Scientific knowledge is accumulated, organized, and used to develop hypotheses and theories, and then hypotheses are tested over time. They're either accepted or rejected, and then if a hypothesis consistently predicts and correctly explains observations, then a scientific theory will eventually develop. So developing the theory of evolution by natural selection. Most scientists for many years, they were agreeing that life forms were unchanging until Comte de Buffon. He was the first to challenge this view in 1749. And he was the first to suggest that humans and apes may share an ancestor. And then by the early 1800s, other scientists began to share his ideas. Next, we have Georges Cuvier. He was a naturalist, and he developed the science of paleontology, which was studying fossils and making predictions about life in the past. And he proposed the idea that Earth had experienced many destructive natural events like floods and volcanic eruptions, and he proposed that these events were violent enough to have eliminated many species. All right, next was, here is just a diagram showing there's deep rock or strata, which is layers of rock, are older, so the ones at the bottom are going to be older than strata that are closer to the surface. So different species of fossilized organisms are found in different rock strata, and basically what this shows, or the evidence shows, that not all life forms came into existence at the same time. Keep in mind that the arrangement of strata varies when mountains are formed, and then the strata are tilted and the oldest layers are towards the inside of the mountain. So younger stratum will have more recent fossils, and an older stratum will have older fossils. All right, next we have Charles Lyell. He rejected Cuvier's proposal and suggested that geological processes were very slow, and that the Earth may be much older than 6,000 years, which is what most people believed it to be. And then Jean-Baptiste Lamarck compared fossils to current species of animals and proposed that species changed over time. Lamarck noticed that he noticed the changing form of species and then provided a hypothesis for the change. And he believed in acquired characteristics Basically, he believed that offspring inherited the beneficial acquired characteristics of their parents. And during that time, even Darwin conscripted to this theory, but it changed as he did some more traveling. So he traveled from England to South America, to Australia, and back to South America during a 5-year voyage on the HMS Beagle. And observations he made in England and while exploring caused Darwin to ask many questions about the natural world, and eventually he developed the theory of evolution by natural selection. This is just his voyage. So here in this chart, we can see his observations and then the questions he got from his observations. So for example, number 1, the flora and fauna of the different regions the Beagle visited were distinct from those that Darwin studied in England and Europe. So for example, rodents. The rodents in South America were structurally similar to one another, but were really quite different from the rodents that he's seen on other continents. So the questions that he had were, if all organisms originated in their present forms during a single event, why was there a distinctive clustering of similar organisms in different regions of the world? And why were all types of organisms not randomly distributed? Okay, another observation, he observed fossils of extinct animals. Here, for example, the armadillo-like Glyptodont that looked very similar to living animals, like the modern armadillo here. So the question he had here was, why would living and fossilized organisms that look similar be found within the same region? Next, finches, which are birds, and other animals he saw on the Galapagos Islands closely resembled animals he'd observed on the west coast of South America. And so the question was, why did the Galapagos species so closely resemble organisms on the adjacent South American coastline? And then here we're looking at finches, the pictures on finches, but he also looked at tortoises as well. They looked identical at first, but they all actually varied slightly between islands. So for example, each type of Galapagos finch was adapted to eating a different type of food based on the size and shape of its beak. And here we can see 10 finch species that occur on one of the islands, Santa Cruz. All right, so here we can see this diagram and all the variations in their beak sizes. So his question was, why was there such a diversity of species in such a small area? And could these species have been modified from an ancestral form that arrived on the Galapagos Islands shortly after the islands were formed? And then lastly, he was breeding pigeons and studying breeds of dogs and varieties of flowers. So he knew that it was possible for traits to be passed on from parent to offspring, and that sexual reproduction resulted in many variations within a species. All right, so his question was, could a process similar to artificial selection also operate in nature? All right, so keep in mind, like he was seeing all this artificial selection in dog breeding and horses and also in farming. All right, some questions here. Question 1, a geologist finds the fossil of a species of fish in one stratum, but not in the stratum above the fossil. How would Cuvier explain this observation? All right, so Cuvier, he would have suggested the species of fish had become extinct, possibly due to a natural catastrophe, such as a flood or a volcanic eruption. Next is Lyell, and how did Lyell's observations about changes in geology inspire naturalists to think about changes in life on Earth? So keep in mind, Lyell was the one that rejected the Cuvier's idea of catastrophe, and he was the one that guessed that Earth changed slowly and continuously over time. His idea had also suggested that Earth was older than 6,000 years. So he believed that slow, continuous change would amount to large changes over time. All right, and then his proposed idea influenced other thinkers like Charles Darwin, who wondered if the same sort of processes and timelines were also occurring in populations. Okay, so here we're looking at the Galapagos Islands, and it's just an example of, we've got two examples here of finches and their food source as well. So Darwin spent years studying life in the Galapagos Islands, and his observations and questions led him to reject Lamarck's theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics for the idea of descent with modification. So Darwin suggested that current species descended from an ancestral species with some modification, and he suggested that the mechanism for this change was natural selection, sometimes referred to as survival of the fittest. So he observed 13 species of finches on the Galapagos Islands, and then he proposed that when two populations of the same species of finch became geographically isolated, so on different islands, they adapted to their separate food sources. And then over time, the populations became so distinct that they became different species. All right, this theory of natural selection doesn't suggest that individuals evolve, but rather that the predominant traits in a population change over time. All right, so we've got this first species here. Looks like this beak would be adapted to eating like maybe hard nuts. And then the second one here, this species would be adapted to eating insects. All right, so in this part of the lesson, make sure you know the different theories from those different scientists. So Cuvier and Lamarck and Darwin, and their theories about evolution. When we're looking at Charles Darwin and Lamarck, they both believed that organisms with beneficial adaptations to the environment would survive. The difference between the theories is how these organisms obtained their adaptations. So Lamarck believed organisms could acquire their adaptations during their lifetimes. Darwin thought that organisms were born with traits which were then selected by nature. And then over time, Darwin said that the beneficial traits would build up in a population, and which will cause the population to change or evolve. So in Lamarck's view, evolution occurred within a single generation or within a few generations, and then Darwin's theory suggested that evolution occurs over many generations and a long period of time. Modern scientists accept Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection to be true, but the debate is about the pace of evolution. Does it happen gradually, or is it happening in punctuated bursts of divergence? All right, so it's still an evolving topic in science, the pace of evolution. The discovery of new species and the risk of extinction of others make the study of speciation and evolution relevant today. So next, we'll be looking at evidence that scientists use to prove evolution has occurred, and the evidence they use to study evolutionary relationships. Next, we're going to look at evidence for evolution. So here we're just looking at a couple images. The Burgess Shale in Yoho National Park. On the left, we have a creature from over 505 million years ago during the Cambrian period. On the right is a picture of Yoho National Park today. All right, so it looked like it was an aquatic environment. Not so anymore. So Darwin's theory of natural selection can explain why some organisms survive and others do not. but what proof exists that natural selection is a viable theory? So fossils is one way to prove that natural selection is a viable theory. So fossils like in the ones here in Burgess Shale can show that organisms have changed over time or have evolved. But what other evidences are there that scientists use to support and study evolution? And that's what we're going to look at. All right, so there's a variety of evidence for evolution. It includes the fossil record, transitional fossils, biogeography, anatomy, embryology, and molecular biology, which is also looking at genetics. All right, trilobite fossils are pictured above, these ones here, can be found in Alberta and all over the world. They became extinct about 245 million years ago, but at one time there were more than 17,000 different species of them. And the closest living relative to trilobites is likely this horseshoe crab. So the fossil record. Fossils provide a record of species that were alive in the past, from early microorganisms to species of animals that are alive today. The fossil record provides evidence about the relative age of fossilized species as well. All right, they appear in chronological order in the rock layers or the strata. Fossils in the youngest layers appearing most closely related to modern species. Strata layers are generally not visible since the older layers are covered by new layers, but in some locations like the Grand Staircase in Utah, which is shown here in this diagram, geological evidence have left the layers exposed. Another location that the layers are exposed is the Alberta's Badlands. So studying this order of the fossils can help determine their age, since the strata are found in chronological order. The order of the fossils can also help scientists organize evolutionary family trees, because, well, not all fossils appear in the record at the same time, and this can help scientists figure out the evolutionary lines between ancestors and living species. Then there are transitional fossils. These are fossils of organisms that show links between groups of organisms and represent an organism at the point where individual lineages diverge. So here, in this example, fossil evidence suggests that whales evolved from a terrestrial ancestor, such as this one here, the Ambulocetus natans, which is on the bottom right. And the fossil of this organism suggests that it walked on land and swam in the water. The transitional fossil, which is the Dorudon right top, is an ancient whale with remnants of tiny hind legs. Next, patterns of distribution. Biogeography, it's the study of the past and present geographical distribution of organisms. Species distribution, both current and from the fossil record, supports the theory of evolution by natural selection. Based on these examples here, geographically close environments are more likely to have related organisms than environments that are separated but similar. Island species tend to resemble mainland organisms from the closest continent. Fossils of the same species have been found on coastlines of neighboring continents. Because at one time all the continents were linked together, which was referred to as Pangaea, and then the movement of continental plates helps to predict when and where animals evolved. Okay. Why is Archaeopteryx considered a transitional fossil? So remember, transitional fossils, if we go back, They're the links between groups of organisms, and they represent an organism at the point where individual lineages diverge. All right, so this organism has characteristics of both reptiles, dinosaurs, and birds. It had feathers, but it also had teeth, claws, and a bony tail. How many years ago did South America and Africa break apart? From 110 to 120 million years ago. When did India become part of Asia? 23 to 30 million years ago. Why are fossils of the reptile, the Cynonathus, found in Africa and South America? Africa and South America were once joined together in that supercontinent. And then lastly, why are there no polar bears in Antarctica or penguins at the North Pole? Because Antarctica and the North Pole were not connected when penguins and polar bears evolved. Okay, next we're going to look at anatomy, and there's two terms here, homologous structures and analogous structures. So anatomical structures that are similar because of common ancestry are called homologous structures. For example, humans, frogs, bats, dolphins, horses, we all have the same basic arrangement of bones in our forelimbs, but they do not always have a common function, right? Like bats fly, dolphins swim, and so on. And analogous structures are structures that are similar and have developed for the same function, but they don't share ancestry. So for example, bird wings and insect wings, they're both adapted for flying, but they evolved independently of one another. All right, and then another source of evidence is embryology. This is the study of studying embryos. So here we're looking at different embryos. We have fish, turtle, salamander, and human. And there's similarities in embryonic development among related groups, such as vertebrates, which provides evidence for common ancestral origin. Next was molecular biology and genetics. So how similar organisms are on a molecular level can also provide evidence of common ancestry. For example, proteins for many species can be observed at a cellular level, and similarities among all multicellular organisms suggest a common ancestor. Scientists compare patterns of DNA in various organisms, and then species with similar patterns most likely inherited those from a common ancestor. Modern genetics supports Darwin's theory of inheritance, which further supports evolution by natural selection. So, for example, all cells consist of membranes filled with water, DNA, proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. There's proteins called enzymes, which control biochemical reactions in all organisms. In all organisms, proteins are synthesized from amino acids. In all organisms, all cells that can replicate contain DNA. DNA carries the genetic information, so therefore scientists can determine how closely related two organisms are by comparing their DNA. And if two species have similar patterns in portions of their DNA, this similarity indicates that these portions of their DNA were most likely inherited from a recent common ancestor. And lastly, we just have to talk about the pace of evolution. So Darwin's theory of evolution remains the basis of many people's understanding of evolution. However, there's still debate about the pace of evolution. Modern day scientists propose two models. It's gradualism or punctuated equilibrium. But both models use the theory of evolution by natural selection, but they have some key differences. So for example, gradualism. This is by evolutionary biologists who support the model of gradualism explain that evolution is a slow and gradual process, and new species appear as a result of many small changes over long periods of time. The fossil record rarely shows these small changes. However, not all changes are present in the fossil record. And then punctuated equilibrium is that evolutionary change occurred in the same way that it appears in the fossil record, which is suddenly. This model proposes periods of equilibrium with very little change in a species and then punctuated by periods of rapid change. All right, so gradualism, and then here is punctuated equilibrium. All right, so just in summary then, what proof is there that present-day species evolved from ancestral forms? So we talked about the Burgess Shale in Yoho National Park. It's an excellent source of evidence for evolution. If Darwin had access to the fossils in the Burgess Shale, he likely would have had even stronger evidence to support his developing theories. There's more evidence today for evolution than Darwin had. Scientists have been accumulating evidence for evolution for more than 150 years. Early evidence, like fossils, led scientists to examine anatomy, so homologous structures, which can be compared between fossils and living organisms. They support Darwin's theory that organisms evolve from ancestral forms. Next, we look at embryo development and similarities in embryo development. For example, a 3-week-old human embryo looks very similar to a chicken embryo, which also seems to support Darwin's theory. And then new discoveries and the advancement of technology allow scientists to look at molecular biology and DNA and the process of cellular reproduction. Scientists have found that human DNA is 98.8% similar to chimpanzee DNA. So this information indicates that at some point there was a common ancestor for the two animals. All right, so I'm just going to pause it here.